All right, we are joined by the one and only Andy Patton with Locked on Zags. Andy, thank you so much for joining us today, man. Excited to talk about some Zags in the NBA.
Yeah, thanks, Vinny. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to do so as well.
Yeah, so we'll just get right into it then. Kind of what were you see the lineup, you see the
Mhm.
matchup come to fruition after that game six in the Eastern Conference Finals, and it's going to be Andrew Nembhard and the Pacers versus Chet Holmgren and the Oklahoma City Thunder. Kind of what were your initial thoughts when you saw that matchup finally come to fruition?
Yeah, I'm very excited. Obviously, I think we've seen some Zags in the NBA Finals, before. Kelly Olynyk was in a few years ago, but it has been fairly rare. And this year, Oklahoma City obviously was fantastic, even with Chet missing so much of the regular season and come into the playoffs as the number one seed. And it kind of felt like, all right, they got a pretty good chance. If it's not them, it might be the Lakers. If it's not them, maybe Denver can make a push. Julian Strawther can get himself to a final. So it really felt like there was a good chance that Zag was coming out of the Western Conference. And it was not as clear on the Eastern Conference side of things, but this Indiana team has just been absolutely red hot the last few months, last month or so. And they kind of did this last year in the playoffs too. And Andrew Nembhard was a big part of it in their run last year that ended up getting ended by the Celtics. But this year, with Jason Tatum getting injured, the Pacers didn't have to play the Celtics. They beat the Knicks, and now we get this really fun matchup. And it was cool when there was only four teams left, and we were realizing, I mean, Anton Watson's not an active member of the New York Knicks, but if the Knicks had made it, he probably would have got himself a ring too. So it was fun to see, like, oh, it feels like we're barreling towards the really high likelihood of a Zag getting a championship, and now it's confirmed. No matter how this thing shakes out, that'll happen, which is very, very cool.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we've both been covering this team for a while now, and we've kind of seen that build up, and especially this kind of set, because as I mentioned, like in like my previous coverage on this, those three guys were all on the same, like
Mhm.
Watson,
Mhm.
Holmgren, and Nembhard were all on the same team together.
Yeah.
So it's crazy to kind of look back on now, like these guys were once teammates, and now,
Mhm.
they're kind of going at it against each other for the NBA's most prized possession.
Yeah, and I mean Strother was on that team too for Denver. Like there was just so many talented players on that roster. I think Hunter Salas will probably be an NBA player in a couple of months, and he was on that team too. It was just a loaded team. I think one of the other thoughts that I know I have and probably many other Zag fans have is just kind of residual frustration that team didn't go as far as perhaps they could have. Drew Timmy also on that team, and they were the team that was a one seed that fell to Arkansas in the Sweet 16 that really struggled with Memphis in the second round, in the round of 32, before Drew kind of put the team on his back and got them a W. But yeah, it's the progression of Mark Few's programs to, having NBA players here and there in the first 10 to 12 years of, the Adam Morrisons, the Blake Stepps, the Dan Dickows, and now you have, guys on so many different teams and multiple guys in the playoffs and an opportunity for guaranteed one player to get a ring. And like you said, players starting on each of these two teams, the only program in college basketball that has a starter on each of the Indiana Pacers and the Oklahoma City Thunder. And that's an incredibly cool accomplishment that should be really celebrated by the folks in Spokane.
Yeah, I completely agree. And let's get into the matchups now.
Mhm.
We'll talk about uh, Chet and Andrew Nemhard's kind of both together, and then we'll break out individually. So just for the sake of this, well, because just in the course of an NBA game, they're not going to be guarding one guy the whole time, but there are guys that they're probably going to be seeing a lot of.
Mhm.
In terms of for Chet Holmgren, he'll probably see a lot of Miles Turner
Yeah.
with the Pacers, and then for Andrew Nembhard, he'll likely have the task of guarding the NBA MVP in Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. What are you looking for both of those guys in those matchups?
Yeah, it's funny. I think both these guys are coming off what were really difficult matchups for them in the conference finals. Andrew Nembhard was defending Jalen Brunson, who's one of the best players in the NBA, one of the best players in the Eastern Conference for sure. And he had a tremendous defensive performance against him in Game 6. Really limited him and was on him pretty much the entire game. And for Nembhard, he still had a good offensive game and still had a good offensive series, but I think his impact in that series was primarily defensively. And hard to not imagine that'll be the case again if he's tasked with guarding Gilgeous-Alexander, who's elite at drawing contact, at getting to the free throw line, and will almost certainly look to try to bait Nembhard into some fouls and get him on the bench, which will be a huge advantage for OKC if he is able to do that. And then on the flip side, Chet was going up against Rudy Gobert, four-time Defensive Player of the Year for Minnesota, and obviously a guy who's not much of an offensive player, so that helps Chet be able to be a bit more roaming defensively and get some blocks that way. But Chet also had a really good offensive series, and that's incredibly impressive to do that against a guy like Gobert, who's got so much length defensively. And Gobert gets a draw some criticism for his defense away from the rim, and certainly we saw OKC attempt to exploit that by having Chet play away from the rim, and that's the advantage that they have, and that's what makes Chet so versatile and dynamic as an offensive player, is his ability to do that. But yeah, now Turner's a great defensive player. He's a great overall player for Indiana, so that's going to be a unique challenge for Chet, and certainly Nembhard's going to have his hands completely full if he's ending up trying to defend Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who's one of, if not the very best player in the league right now.
Yeah, and then kind of going off of that, going back to Holmgren a little bit, you mentioned the kind of gauntlet that he had
Mhm.
to go through. And although like this second round, like this finals here, the
Mhm.
names may not be as quote unquote
Yeah,
big, like they're
yeah.
still like solid names that he has to,
Mhm.
look at, like
Mhm.
you mentioned the Denver
Mhm.
series having to guard Jokic, and this most recent series having not just Rudy Gobert but Julius Randle as well.
Yeah.
This series not only does he might see Miles Turner, but
Mhm.
also Pascal Siakam,
Yeah.
who um, Draymond Green, one of the best
Mhm.
defenders in the league, said the other day, outside of Julius Randle, who Chet played the series before, was his Siakam, talking about
Mhm.
Siakam, was like his heart one of the hardest covers that he had. So it
Mhm.
doesn't get easy for him, but it almost feels like he's kind of built up to this with some really good tests in Jokic, a two-time
Mhm.
MVP, I believe, and
Yeah.
then most recently with just two guys solid as Gobert and Julius Randle.
Yeah, and I think, OKC, they're really good team defense, and so they're able to kind of flex matchups a little bit, and they do some things differently that I think allows Chet to not just be absolutely buried in trying to stop the other team's best player all game long, because OKC doesn't want that. I mean, I think the benefit is they have a player who they let just lock in defensively and don't ask for much offensively. That's Lou Dort. And so I think that when they can kind of have their best defenders focus on defense and their other players kind of have different roles. And Isaiah Hartenstein's a bit more of a physical big, and so they can kind of use him in some of those matchups. And I think a lot of it is coaching. OKC is really well coached, and that allows Chet to kind of flex his various skills. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see it. Does he end up in some one-on-one matchups on Pascal Siakam? Because Siakam's going to be able to do some things that most of the players Chet guards are not able to do, and so that could kind of challenge him in a unique way. But also if Siakam's guarding Chet, then Chet has an advantage where he can maybe, use his size to his advantage on that end of the floor. If they put Turner on him, Chet can pull away from the rim and kind of mitigate Miles Turner's shot blocking ability, which could be helpful for Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and the other guards on that OKC roster. So again, he's so versatile in what he can do and how he commands attention from opposing defenses that I think it makes him, even in matchups that are going to be a little bit difficult for him, like Siakam would be, like Turner might be, he still creates so many disadvantages for the opposing team just because of his unique unicorn type style of play.
Yeah, and I was just looking here. Now going back to Nembhard. It almost kind of feels like it's a reverse in a way of Holmgren because
Yeah.
like the buildup for Holmgren is like he's faced all like the best of the best leading up
Mhm.
to this still tough challenge, but almost Nemhard's test is the best now
Yeah.
with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, like you mentioned the series before against the Knicks having to go against Jalen Brunson, but even in that Cleveland series having to um, I know he was a little injured and had some stuff,
Hmm.
but Donovan Mitchell
Yeah.
um, and such like it hasn't been too easy for Nembhard either, but like this
Mhm.
is going to be his ultimate test with, the this year's MVP.
Yeah, doesn't get much tougher than Shy. He's unbelievably talented, and I know that there's been some criticism of his style of play, and he's always getting to the free throw line. I know some people don't like that, but it's a product of the modern game, and he's got so much length and burst athletically out on the perimeter, and he's if he's able to get an advantage on you, he's going to take it. He's going to get to the cup, and he's going to put pressure on Indiana's shot blockers, Turner and such. And yeah, for the Pacers, if Nembhard's in foul trouble or if Tyrese Halliburton's in foul trouble or anything like that, like that's going to test their depth in a major way. And Nembhard has what I would argue is maybe an advantage, having played with Shai a lot because they're both members of Team Canada. They're both on the Olympic team together this year, and they're familiar with each other's game, which again is perhaps a good or a bad thing depending on how you look at it. I'm sure Shai is pretty well aware of what Nembhard's going to be bringing to the table in this series as well, but. Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting. I'm very curious how much Nembhard does defend Shea one-on-one, whether there's some double teams, some early traps they're trying to send at him, which is something that OKC has done a good job of getting out of, and they'll just probably dump the ball to Jalen Williams and let him create, which is it's crazy that might be Indiana's best option because Jalen Williams is really good, but they have, if they're letting Shea go one-on-one, that's going to be a problem as well. So I'm really interested to see kind of what Indiana does defensively and specifically how they deploy Nembhard, because his defense has been one of the biggest storylines for this team this year. I mean, he was the conference defensive player of the month back in January, and he, like we said, locked up Jalen Brunson quite a bit in that last series with the Knicks. So I don't expect him to have that level of success defensively against Gilgeous-Alexander because very few people do. But if he is able to have a positive impact defensively against SGA and can contribute offensively, I mean, that's point blank. That's what Indiana needs him to do in order to have a chance to win this series.
Yeah, and just to keep going with Nembhard, I was actually in preparing for this interview. I one of our photojournalists, kind of who's into basketball and he's been watching and such, he showed me the Sports Illustrated cover, that
Hmm.
famous one of the Zags, and it's Mark Few, Drew Timme, Corey Kispert, Jalen Suggs, and Joel Ayayi.
Hmm.
And the guy that's not on there, who was on that team, was Andrew Nembhard.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to kind of feel like, because I think a lot of Zag fans know, and like guys who've been watching Gonzaga basketball know how good he is and how good
Hmm.
he was at Gonzaga, but I almost felt like he never got that maybe national or
Hmm.
recognition or attention like some of those other guys did. And granted, those guys were all really good as well, but it
Hmm.
almost kind of feels like he's in a similar spot now with the Pacers, just because he's like, there's Tyrese Halliburton, who's the
Hmm.
star, and Pascal Siakam, like I mentioned,
Hmm.
who's um, NBA champion, and Miles
Hmm.
Turner, who's like their longtime veteran
Yeah.
guy that's been there for his whole career. And it almost kind of feels like Nemhart's kind of going under the radar
Hmm.
again, but at the same time, it's helping him
Hmm.
reach this national recognition that he got, kind of eclipsing, at least in the previous series, with that historic game where he had 6 steals, the most by
Hmm.
anyone like in a conference closeout game.
Yeah, I think Andrew has always been a little bit under the radar, and that Gonzaga cover is a great example of that. As he was a guy who transferred to Gonzaga, and then they kind of thought he was going to sit out that year right up until the start of the season. Like it was 4 days before the season began, he got that eligibility, and so he started the year coming off the bench, and then switched into the starting lineup with Anton Watson. And it's crazy to think about how deep that roster was. The two NBA players were the fifth and sixth guys on that team, and yeah, I think Joel Ayayi was a guy who deserved to have the attention that he got that year. But Andrew is the guy who's had the more prolific professional career since then, and I think he's okay with that. I think he's somebody who uses that to have a chip on his shoulder, and we've seen that with his younger brother Ryan, who didn't get the invite to the NBA draft combine until he balled out at the G League elite camp, and it's kind of the same thing of like, yeah, doubt us if you must, but we're going to continue to prove you wrong. And Andrew's done that throughout his career. He wasn't expected to be a second round pick at all, and then he was an early second round pick, and then pretty quickly he proved he belonged higher than that in that draft class. And so these are two young men who love to prove people wrong, and I think Andrew's perfectly content being that kind of unheralded star on this Indiana team. Because I'll tell you what, the Pacers fans, the people who watch that team every day, they love him. They absolutely adore him and what he brings to that team. And I don't think that there's a lot of concern that maybe the national media doesn't talk about him as much because they'd like him to stay under the radar. If Oklahoma City doesn't scout Nembhard enough, that's to Indiana's advantage, and I'm sure they will. I'm sure they're going to be well aware of what he is able to bring. But yeah, he is a guy who kind of flies under the radar, and this is a good opportunity for him to really put his stamp on this series and kind of turn some heads. I mean, shoot, I did a poll on the Locked On Zags YouTube channel saying which of these two Zags you think will have a bigger impact. And it was about 65-35 for Chet versus Nembhard. And I was like, I'm almost like I'm a lot closer to 50-50 on that. Like I think there's a really good chance that Nembhard is just as impactful as Chet. And that's not taking anything away from Chet. It's more of a compliment to Nembhard and what I think he can do in this series.
And at the you're talking about Ryan at the time of this recording,
Mhm.
he has a or has a
Mhm.
workout with the Golden State Warriors. So he's getting that. And I think he had a couple other with some NBA
Mhm.
teams as well. So those seems like it's the theme of the Nembhard brothers to
Yeah.
go under the radar. And, it wouldn't be so
Mhm.
surprising to kind of see if Ryan Nembhard is, as good, if not better than his brother in the league. Just kind
Yeah,
of
he's a
seeing
little
what his
smaller.
brother's on. Yeah.
A little smaller, which will be tough, but
Yeah.
man,
Yeah.
he's a talented
Completely.
player.
Yeah. Last question for you. Kind of what I mentioned to you earlier. We've both been covering this team respectively
Mhm.
um, for a while now, and I think we understand how big this series is for
Mhm.
in terms of I think it's going to be a great NBA final series, but for all the Zags fans kind of watching, like it's going to be cool regardless of who
Mhm.
wins that to see a Gonzaga Bulldog,
Mhm.
former Gonzaga Bulldog win their first ever NBA championship. Kind of just if you can try to
Mhm.
if you could sum up kind of what does this mean not just for like the Gonzaga men's basketball community, but also
Mhm.
the broader Spokane community as fans watch this finals.
Yeah, I think it's as much as Gonzaga has had NBA success, like this is rare, And I mean, when Oklahoma City punched their ticket, Chet Holmgren became the second ever Zag to start in the NBA Finals. I mean, again, the game has not happened yet as we're recording this, but Chet will start, and he will become the second, and Nembhard will become the third Zags to start in the NBA Finals. And the only other one who's done that was John Stockton. So they're the first two players in the Mark Few era. And when you think about the Mark Few era and how long this program has had this success, this streak of making the NCAA tournament over 25 years, and and how many great players they've had, and for these two guys to be the next two players to start in the finals after the great John Stockton is. I think it deserves maybe more recognition than it's getting. I think a lot of people are like, well, yeah, of course, Gonzaga's been putting guys in the league. This was bound to happen, or we kind of thought this had already happened. And it's like, no, they've put some guys in the finals, but most of them have been limited contributors. Adam Morrison's got a couple rings, but he didn't play much for those teams. Austin Day didn't play much for San Antonio when they got a ring of about a decade ago. Ronny Turiaf was on a championship team, but like they haven't had a lot of big time contributors for NBA playoff teams. And then this year they had so many, not just Chad and Andrew, but Julian, like we mentioned, who had that huge game 6 against Oklahoma City. And Brandon Clark was on a playoff team as well, a guy like Jalen Suggs was hurt for Orlando, but they were in the playoffs in part because of what he was able to do. And we'll continue to see that. Rui was with the Lakers, Corey Kispert was with Washington, a team that did not make the playoffs, but he's a big contributor for them. Like this is a huge step for this program. And they're not only one of the kind of they're not only growing in their space as a NBA as a franchise with NBA player potential, but they're one of the best in college basketball already. I mean, Kentucky's still number one, and then Duke and UCLA and Kansas are kind of in that mix, but Gonzaga's legitimately right there. Like they're kind of on par with Arizona and a few others in terms of how many total players they have in the NBA, but also how many players they have contributing in the NBA and starting and they're still limited on the All Stars. Obviously, Domantas Sabonis, who I didn't mention should have been an all-star this past year, but has been an all-star a couple of times. And Chet Holmgren's going to be an all-star. I think it's possible a healthy Jalen Suggs ends up being an all-star someday. Maybe Andrew Nembhard will sneak into the all-star conversation. It could happen. And so for this program to have gone from, hey, we have a couple guys, getting drafted in the late second round and playing a year or two in the league, to we have, 10 plus guys in the league, and most of them are really significant contributors, is a really big step. And I think one that the Spokane community, the Gonzaga community, the men's basketball community should be incredibly proud of.
All righty, that's all I have for you, Andy. Is there anything else you want to add? Anything you want to let people know, kind of the stuff that you're working on as we not just get ready for this final series, but also kind of next thing you know, we'll be back in the kennel watching the Gonzaga Bulldogs.
Back
So,
in the kennel, man. Cannot wait. Yeah, no, check out Locked On Zags. That's wherever you get podcasts on YouTube as well. Doing shows still 5 days a week. We're going to be doing 5 days a week until August, and we'll drop down a little bit. But yeah, we're going to be covering Ryan Nembhard as he gets prepared for the NBA draft. We'll be covering any more transfer portal additions, anything else going on with the Zags this offseason. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Check it out if you haven't yet. I appreciate it.
all righty, that is Andy Patton with Locked On Zags. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Vinny.